Awesome. Good morning, Tim. So glad you could join via Microsoft Teams to share a little bit about this biodiversity on church grounds resource that we've been working on. So just for some context, last year the Auckland Anglican Diocese passed a motion wanting to put in some effort to create a resource and also support churches to look at how we can be stewarding our land, our grounds in a way that builds and sustains and supports and encourages biodiversity. And so I have Tim with me here today, who is helping me with this resource. Tim, would you like to just share a little bit about who you are and your background?
Sure. So my name's Tim Martin. I'm currently based in Whangarei, and my wife, Liz Martin, is Anglican priest in the Auckland Diocese. I was that kid who was always just collecting bugs, growing plants, nature mad, or maybe nature obsessed, to be truthful. And that passion just didn't stop. So I carried on to study biodiversity and environmental science at University of Auckland. Eventually graduating with a MSc and PhD in those fields. And now I work as an environmental consultant, particularly in biodiversity and sustainable land use. And that work takes me around New Zealand and also the Pacific and into Asia. So next week I'm working for Te Fund in Vanuatu, for example, looking at biodiversity and coffee growing.
Cool, very interesting. You've obviously been part of Anglican churches yourself with Liz. What are some of the potential differences you see that churches can make by, trying to look after our land and our grounds differently?
I think when I look at Anglican churches around the Auckland Diocese, I see what I see typically in people's gardens as well, and that often they're quite bereft of any Indigenous biodiversity. They're just shortly mowed lawns with a few scattered trees. The trees might be exotics or natives. But generally, they're kind of in line with the biological desert, quote unquote, that many urban and rural spaces can be. But that doesn't need to be the case. With some careful thought, church grounds could actually be little bastions of Indigenous biodiversity in the landscape and sort of help to turn that picture around.
So what is the difference, as you kind of mentioned, between the way that we're looking after our grounds now and how we could be looking after our grounds? Is there a shift in the way we think about it?
Yeah, I think the best way to look at that question is probably to contrast what we see in nature. If we're walking in a national park or a wild area, and then contrast that with what we see in a typical garden or church ground today. So typical church grounds will have shortly mown lawns. They might have some garden beds where there are patches of bare soil with scattered plants put into them, annuals or little shrubs, carefully pruned. All the there's no sort of logs or leaf litter lying around. It's very sort of manicured and neat. Whereas if you look at probably some of the most aesthetically beautiful as well environments in a national park and look at that, there will be logs and there'll be rocks and there'll be moss and lichens and there will be some grasses, maybe some shrubs, maybe some taller trees. So nature is far more complex than most gardens, and not just in terms of the plants, but there are things in that garden as well, or the other things in that space, like the logs and the rocks and the stumps. They all contribute to diversity of habitat and then also the diversity of biodiversity that habitat can support. So I think, yeah, you can contrast those two and look at what's missing from typically most church gardens or church grounds, and look at nature and say, well, what do we need to add back into this to push towards a better outcome for biodiversity in church grounds?
So yeah, we in a lot of our church grounds, we spend a lot of time just mowing our lawns, which I suppose as an ecosystem is not very diverse. So, what are some tips? simple ways that churches might get on board with this? What are some different practices that I guess we can get on board with?
Yeah, sure. So I think looking at what areas around the church grounds could be what we call rewilding, so putting back to a more natural wild state a part of the church ground. And that doesn't necessarily need to mean it's on large scale or a lot of work. It could actually be simply one garden bed by the church entrance. It could be quite small scale. But when I say rewilding, what I'm meaning is to put some Indigenous biodiversity back into that environment. And again, looking at that sort of nature example, that's often multi-layered. So can we get some ground covers and grasses and some shrubs into that environment? So you've got multi-layers, because that's really helpful for biodiversity. If there's any tree pruning happening, can we actually put some logs on the ground to provide habitat for skinks and beetles and gecko and our Indigenous fauna that are very reliant on cover in the landscape to survive, where there are rats and possums, for example. And also looking at what we've got and valuing old trees in the church grounds. As an ecologist looks at trees, the older the tree gets, the more valuable it is. And even when the tree starts to lose health and start that long process of dying, that's actually the most valuable tree ecologically in the landscape, because then it'll have tree holes for nesting birds to nest in, or have flaky bark for long-tailed bats to roost in, or actually still produce a lot of fruit, because it's the oldest trees in the landscape that produce a lot of fruit and nectar for Indigenous biodiversity. So looking at our old trees and not looking at them as liabilities, but as assets to be retained as long as possible, is a real key part of biodiversity in the landscape as well. And another thing that's happening and being trialled now around Auckland as well, by Auckland Council, is changes to mowing regime. So typically lawns will be mown on like a 2-weekly cycle throughout the whole year. So 26 mows per annum. Unless an area is high use, like a footpath or an area where people walk over a lot, that's really unnecessary. And even reducing mowing to every 3 weeks or perhaps every 4 will actually foster a lot more biodiversity in those lawns, while still keeping them for the purpose of human access and use and so forth. So looking at the mowing regime, that will reduce fossil fuel use, because obviously every mow you skip or every mow you do slightly longer actually adds up to a lot of fossil fuel use reduction over a course of a year. And then when you allow your lawns to grow a little bit longer between mows, you're increasing the amount of flowers that can happen in the environment for insects and other pollinators. And you're also increasing how much flood or stormwater soakage that lawn can take up as well in a flood event. So more water will go into that soil if it's got a slightly reduced mowing regime or a slightly longer turf than it will if it's essentially shorn to an inch of its life every 2 weeks. So that's a way of actually increasing biodiversity through less resource output and lowering costs.
Yeah, it's interesting, because sometimes it's just a little bit of a shift in the way we, I suppose, think about the aesthetics of our land and our grounds. Have you seen some examples of how this has worked, either in your own spaces or in churches that you've been at, of what's possible when you begin to rewild?
Yeah, so if you have an area that's, say, closely mown lawns and that's it, and you plant back Indigenous biodiversity in terms of native shrubs, grasses, you will get species coming back that we're not using the habitat at all prior. So obviously if you have the lawn and you plant some kōwhai trees in sort of 5 to 10 years, you're going to have that area being used by tui as a food source. Or if you put logs and rocks into your gardens and encourage dense ground cover rather than the bare dirt with scattered annuals kind of approach, Indigenous skinks and geckos will move back into that habitat. I've seen it myself in my own backyard, where I went from lawn to a dense native ground cover garden, and in came the copper skink, which are now threatened at risk in the Auckland area. So that stuff will happen. If you build it, they will come, is the I suppose, the motto for that. It can be quite encouraging just to see that turnaround from a biological desert to something that's diverse and more how nature intended it to be.
Yeah, and it sounds like it doesn't even have to be at a massive scale. You can do this just in your own backyard, or even with churches in inner cities with very little space can become kind of like an oasis for biodiversity and for life. Obviously, you're probably aware we have a lot of old cemeteries on our churches. Do you have any experience to share about what are some of the opportunities in these spaces? Obviously, they have historical significance and, other monuments and things like that, headstones. But yeah, are there opportunities in those spaces too for, I suppose, mixed use and thinking about life and biodiversity?
Yeah, cemeteries are really interesting and something that can be far more than they typically are in our current landscape. Often cemeteries by old churches are called God's acre because it's essentially an acre of ground where it's given to God and the remains of people, and shift there for God's acre to be something that is beautiful and biodiverse. So if we look back at historically the old church cemeteries were, I'm talking about going back into the late 1800s or the early 1900s, that's prior to the advent of the petrol mower. And these cemeteries were probably or shorn or grazed by sheep, perhaps, to keep the grass down quite intermittently. And in between, things were naturally wild, and that was accepted. You don't see the one exception, Waikamiti Cemetery in West Auckland, where that historic view of how cemeteries should look is kept, and they actually have about a two per annual mowing regime. So in between, the wildflowers grow, and it can be a massive colour in the spring with wildflowers because of that change in mindset shift, and that could be done elsewhere as well. I was involved for a while with a cemetery in Panmure that was a historic church cemetery that was maintained by mowing, and around the graves it was maintained by herbicides just to knock out any weeds in the cracks. And so rather than having sort of grannies which were historically weeds, and it looked amazing, and people were like, oh wow, this is such an amazing place to walk around now. It's so interesting for an area that is God's acre. So that was reduced pesticide use, reduced weeding, increased beauty, increased biodiversity in a broad sense, not just indigenous, but exotic wildflowers. But they serve a purpose in terms of fostering a different way of looking at our environment.
Awesome. I think I did lose you just a little bit there. What in terms of what you were saying about what were some practices that were shifted in Panmure? Could you just
So the key thing there, the key thing there that shifted was stopping using herbicide to maintain the bare concrete and bare earth areas around the graves, but instead insert into that low-growing wildflowers, which they've got very weak root systems, so it's not going to affect the graves at all. But essentially, nature abhors a vacuum. So if you don't put something desirable into those cracks between the graves, something undesirable will grow. So shifting it towards something that is beautiful, but also in keeping with a historic cemetery in terms of the look and feel of the place. So reduced herbicide use, increased biodiversity. And then the next step for that environment, I'm not involved there anymore, would have been looking at where do we mow? Can we, for example, keep mowing the paths on a 2-weekly mow regime, but maybe leave other areas to go 4 weeks between mowing to increase the biodiversity and wildness of those other lawn areas.
Oh, very cool. Yes, I mean, as you're kind of just saying that, I know that in the UK, there are lots of examples of cemeteries that have been around for centuries and are almost the last places where there's still an aspect of wildness in the context of urbanization. Obviously, New Zealand doesn't have the same history, but it's helpful to think about it in that different way. I did wonder if you had any thoughts in terms of churches that are growing food. Obviously, community gardens are something that are on top of mind for people, and we see a lot of churches growing food. How do you see that interacting with this picture of building biodiversity?
Yeah, I think they're very much in keeping, because the biodiversity crisis that we currently face, it's partly about habitat loss, it's partly about invasive species, it's partly about a rapidly changing human-driven climate change happening at such a pace that biodiversity can't keep up and adapt with it. So anything we do to reduce our environmental footprint in our church grounds is going to also help biodiversity survive and flourish. So growing food locally obviously reduces food miles, reduces fossil fuel use, fosters people to think more about their local environment and how they interact with it as well. If you're growing food, it's quite a good mechanism for growing understanding of people and place, that sort of inherent connections. And also these things I've been talking about, like having plant systems that are multi-layered with ground covers and grasses and shrubs and trees, or including logs as assets rather than something that has to be mulched and taken away. These are completely compatible with food growing spaces as well, and in fact will actually help food growing, because the more biodiverse systems you have to grow your food, probably the less prone you are to pest outbreaks, for example. So yeah, it's very much in keeping and can be a compatible approach to also foster biodiversity within any food growing ecosystems.
Yeah, I did recently hear a talk around soil health and how important and significant it is just having diversity of planting. So this idea of food forests as an idea, as something that's kind of popped up as another way of approaching growing food, but also growing other flowers or things that are not edible, but for the purposes of biodiversity. How do you see potentially the way that we might think about, as you've kind of mentioned, climate change in the context of this, and the way we look after our grounds, and the way that we might need to adapt or shift our practices, or be more drought or storm proof?
Yeah, so a move to have at least some areas of church grounds in native plantings that in some way emulate natural habitats is going to help that in multiple ways. So it's a permanent garden, so it's not going to require you to keep on going to the garden centre and buying plants in plastic pots and bring them there and planting them. It's not going to require fertiliser, because our native plants have been here without fertiliser for millennia, so they don't need it when you plant them. They're not going to require watering, because again, they're adapted to whatever droughts or floods or salt winds or whatever are thrown at us as an environment, because they're the native plants for here. So native plants over exotic plants will require less resources to maintain, and also be more resilient to our changing climate, which is coming more and more to the fore with even the events of this past summer. And also just the ecosystem function of our church ground spaces. So areas that are in hard surfaces, the rain lands on and it rushes straight to the stormwater drains and causes downstream flooding. The opposite end of the spectrum to that is a native garden or a food forest or a rewilded cemetery, whereby the plants in that environment and perhaps the less modern lawns in that environment can soak up more of that rainwater before it falls off. So that's going to help climate resilience as well, if we can rewild or reinsert Indigenous biodiversity into our church grounds or our food growing spaces or our cemeteries.
Yeah, there's a lot of positive flow-on effects, even just from some very simple actions that churches can start on. Yeah, I mean, it's very exciting just having this conversation, because I think sometimes it can feel quite overwhelming thinking about, oh, how do we even get started? And the resource that we're working on will give some more practical tips in terms of planting and what sorts of things that are beneficial. And I think is what you mentioned around that balance of, you know, in a cemetery, you think, oh, the weeds are going to break apart the headstones or the, you know, whatever is there. But actually, if you choose the right sorts of plants, that can actually help protect that site and those headstones and significant monuments. Oh, very cool. Oh, well, thank you very much, Tim, for your time. And hopefully there'll be another opportunity when we can have you face to face with some of the churches to get your thoughts and insights on some of our sites. But yes, kia ora.
Thank you very much.